Thanks very much for having me today. And it was just interesting to see some of those traffic slides before. I'm from Melbourne, don't hold that against me. But I must say that every time I come to Sydney, I notice how much worse the traffic is. And I was trying to have a board meeting on the phone this morning. I know that's sort of just what happens. That's why my presentation wasn't already on the slide deck. And just walking around with buses and cars and thinking, okay, we've got work to do here. But thank you very much for that introduction. CoDesign Studio is an organisation that I guess focuses very much at the neighbourhood level. So if I guess just in contrast to Peter's great context about the future direction of cities, want to sort of take this down to local neighbourhood level, I guess at the level that we experience cities and communities every day in one of those sort of smaller building blocks of the cities where we live. We've worked in around 100 neighbourhoods across Australia, and I guess the lessons that I want to talk about today are drawn from some of that community activation experience. But in starting, I think I'd love you to reflect on a place or a neighbourhood that you love in some way. Perhaps it's the neighbourhood where you grew up, or the local cafe where you like to go, a holiday spot. Just turn to the person next to you. I know that's awkward, sorry if you know them. If you don't know them, say hi, introduce yourself, and just talk to them for a moment about what are some of the characteristics of a place that you love. Let's get a show of hands if a place that you love is sort of a place of natural beauty in some ways. A lot of you. How about a place that's really active and vibrant and busy and brings lots of people together? Or perhaps a place that has a lot of memory or nostalgia or something associated with a place that it's got a particular experience for you. I think that the places that we love and feel connected to have distinctive personalities. They're memorable. And they have a degree of connection that we have with them. But it's very hard to plan and achieve in planning that kind of level of connection in place. The memories, the stories, the experiences, which are what makes neighbourhoods livable. And I think the question that this comes to is what does it take? Like, what is required in terms of process and design to shape neighbourhoods that deliver that kind of social sustainability, that really thrive in that way? And I think I mentioned before I'm from Melbourne. Yes, 7 years in a row, world's most livable city. But I think you and I will all know that that is a very sort of biased and sort of small window on Melbourne actually is. And while I think with enormous credit the city's transformation in the past 20 or 30 years, and it is on a global scale a very livable place, we still have the stark reality of the future of urban development in the city, and a big difference between the promise and the reality. And having trained in urban design, I've worked on many, many beautiful projects that have not quite eventuated the kind of experience that we had imagined. And that's made me really think a lot about how we work as professionals and processes. If we look at that and sort of zoom out for a moment about what that looks like, I think 1/3 of Australians don't know their neighbours, that 2/3 don't trust their neighbours, which is perhaps a more alarming statistic. And loneliness is now as likely to kill you as smoking or heart disease. And that is, I think, a statistic of kind of health epidemic proportions that we need to be really seriously thinking about in terms of the way that we plan and design neighbourhoods. I think coming back to trust for a moment, I think and this is perhaps in relation to what's happening in Sydney, and I think the Resilient Sydney's report puts, diminishing social cohesion at number 2 of the greatest risk factors affecting Sydney. I mean, certainly we have housing affordability, major challenges, transport, other health services stress, but social cohesion, I wondered if we tried to sort of write down what do we think are the top 10 factors influencing Sydney. It's number 4 in Melbourne. It's still very high in that area. Would we put social cohesion at number 2? And I think thinking about this, there was a criminal psychologist, Gordon Allport, back in the 50s who did a lot of work on trying to understand why people would react against each other in certain ways. And what he found was that social tolerance was built up by walking past and having eye contact with people who were not like you every day. On the train, in the park, in your local neighbourhood. They might not be your friends and family, but you walked past and had contact with, he calls it contact theory, people who are not like you. So if we start to remove those everyday experiences, if we're not catching the train, if we're not walking our kids to school, if we're not socialising with people who are not like us in the park, and we are instead socialising with people who are just exactly the same as us online, then we stop being so tolerant. And this causes other fractures in our society. But it's directly related to neighbourhoods. Coming back to place, I always come back to this quote that actually it's difficult to design a space that won't attract people, right? But why don't we do it? It's so often not accomplished in that ways. And look, I think we have a disconnect between the way that we plan and design cities. Who's been this person? I'm this person a lot of the time. And the community. And look, to be fair, I work in community engagement. It has got so much better than this, and you rarely see this day. But this kind of scenario creates this polarisation of community viewpoints that isn't cohesive in the way that we want to really be shaping and planning cities. So I would draw a sort of change of approach here in what I would sort of say is planning and what is placemaking. And we need both of those. We certainly need a long-range foresight view, but we shouldn't be so specific about that. I mean, I'm not reading about a 50-year plan for the iPhone, right? Because we don't know how we're going to live in the future, but we have sort of trends and predictions. What I notice in our plans is we plan them as if it was going to be, in 50 years, as if it was going to be delivered tomorrow. And we often overlook the very immediate experience, those memories, those connections. And so what I want to talk about today is what a community-led approach to placemaking would look like. What would it look like if we inspired everyday citizens, traders, organisations to participate in co-creating the city with us? And I'm not talking about this kind of placemaking. I think when you say you work in placemaking, there is often an association with a lot of fake grass. And that might be a great solution in some contexts, but that overlooks, I think, the purpose of what placemaking is about, which is about having a more collaborative approach to shaping cities. So at its sort of highest level, if you like, and this may be familiar for some of you, we can talk about kind of like getting the bones or the hardware or the physical a state of space. And if we focus on that alone, it's unlikely to work. Interestingly, if you focus on the people side alone, it kind of works a little bit. This is a very informal street in Hanoi. Getting both of them right is where we want to go. But it's easier for us to consider the physical aspects because they're more measurable, they're more tangible. We can talk about building heights and traffic flows and metres squared of a certain area. When we start to talk about experience and memory and behaviour, you might be glazing out already. It's hard to measure, even though we know it's important. So placemaking can become a way of catalysing some of these things, and certainly it's about amenities and infrastructure, absolutely, fundamentally, and that's probably the easiest place to start. It's about the people, the social life and the culture, and the events, the activities and programs. But the piece of that puzzle that I think is often overlooked, and this comes from research from the Young Foundation in the UK, is, I guess, what you might call the operating system, if we just want to stretch the computer analogy as far as it can possibly go. But it's the role of leadership and voice and influence, and that how we conduct our place management in a way that is collaborative and democratic is actually critical for our social sustainability. So all of those three. How do we get there? That's the million-dollar question. I think we've got a lot of great ideas in planning, but we don't deliver them. It's equally true for social sustainability. But I think placemaking provides us with a lens of at least starting to have that conversation, of at least starting to unpack those issues. And I think the first thing to acknowledge is that places are always going to be in some form of a state of transition from now to the future. So we're not just kind of designing in an abstract context, we're designing in a context of places needing to transition in some way, and not just translate the physical space, but translate our behaviour around that space as well. So, you know, we've got a current place, a future place, and something in between, some kind of a transition period, which is the ideal context where placemaking can play a role. And if you look at Jamie Lerner and others' work, they say that transition really can happen in about 3 years if you're smart about how you use your tactics for change, which I think is a shorter term time frame from what we often consider with urban development. So if a traditional approach is perhaps more linear in a planning, design, delivery, and we certainly need to have certain objectives for the long-range trends and infrastructure needs. But this approach from a social sustainability perspective can be challenging for people to engage with, and it can breed some of this sort of situation. A tactical approach, taken from startup thinking, how would we build the new iPhone? Well, we wouldn't create a 50-year plan. We'd probably create a prototype, would test it with a group of early adopters, would see how they used it, how they experienced it, and we'd take that feedback to build the next model and, rinse and repeat. So if we apply that model to planning, although that might seem abstract in some ways, I think we always want to start with a plan and a vision and knowing where we're going, but we can actually test a huge amount of things quite cheaply, quite low cost, to understand how behaviour will work, to understand how the social impact will work, to understand how those physical changes will work, measure them and revise our plans accordingly. So that can be a project that you could do for an hour, for example, for a weekend, or for a summer, and different levels of criteria that you would look on measuring and understanding the influence of that place. There's a whole bunch of case studies around this approach, tactical urbanism. Our colleagues from Roberts Day in the room also do work in this space. And this guidebook is a couple of years old now, but it was trying to kind of collate Australian examples of tactical urbanism. And that's not, they're all sort of, we should probably do another version because there's been such an explosion of projects since then. But I think 700,000 people have downloaded this document, and I think that's a sort of testament to the diversity of projects that are happening around Australia. And these weren't our projects, they're others. But just to give you a couple of case studies in how this approach, I think, can be useful for shaping healthy neighbourhoods. And I want to talk about that around the concept of place, people and process, coming back to that hardware, software operating system analogy before, and looking at the dynamics between them. So looking at places, how do we activate places for social and physical activity? And I want to talk about Mallup Street, Geelong. Is anyone here from City of Greater Geelong? Yes, great. We do have some people here. So this is a couple of years ago. We worked with council on looking at how do you transition your main street from a busy thoroughfare, car-dominated thoroughfare, to something like the sketch in this picture, a sort of green pedestrian space. Now you can just build it. If you've got the funding and the permits and everything, you can just build it. But we know, like in many other areas of our life, if you just do things to people, they don't necessarily react very well. It's much more important to bring people on a journey around behaviour, particularly if we're talking about how do we inspire changes in cycling activities. Cycling lanes are certain a part of this project in terms of use of pedestrian spaces in a different way. So our approach working with council was to prototype this space. So we spent 3 months building a one-to-one prototype of what it could be like using temporary paint. It was installed over the course of a weekend and monitored over 3 months to understand how that would drive behaviour change. Now, there were positive and negative reactions from that. It was... In some, the levels of cycling dramatically increased, the levels of pedestrian use increased, but there were concerns from traders about losing car parks, which you can understand. That's sort of a common, if you remove a car park anywhere in Australia, the sky's going to fall. I'm sure you know that. But by being able to sort of experiment and test and actually see it working in action, it actually helped to sort of craft and change some of those conversations. But we also found that there were new users, like young people who previously weren't using this space as much, suddenly had somewhere to sit and explore and experiment because it's a space that you didn't have to pay for. So this project in context, it sort of was looking in terms of the Main Street strategy, but also the cycling strategy, and that was a plan that existed. There was a long-term view of building a future place, but weren't quite sure how it would work. And there were two different levels of trials that we undertook. One was just a one-day kind of citywide experiment with a whole bunch of partners around cycling activity, and another was the prototype that I just mentioned. But I think in some ways, if you look at kind of the budget allocation there, there's like, less than 1%, about 1% of the budget allocated to a trial in order to shift behaviour, test that your design's going to work. And it's a pretty low investment up front for getting a much stronger long-term outcome. Secondly, on inspiring community leadership, I've got just 2 case studies left in terms of timing. But we worked with Cardinia Lakeside, really different context, outer Greenfield suburb in Melbourne. Great suburb in many ways. Residents there were, does anyone here from Cardinia Shire Council? Residents were really satisfied with their neighbourhood, but they felt in many ways that they'd been given a very glossy brand new place that wasn't their own. I'm sure in the sort of favourite places that you described earlier, perhaps there was places that you had memories attached to. They possibly weren't somewhere brand new. And so we worked with residents and it was their idea. They wanted to do a community arts event. They created artwork over a weekend. They installed it in a public space. And regardless of what you think of this particular artwork, it was very meaningful for the people who created it and installed it and felt that they had their fingerprints and personality on that space. But it also, I think the long-term impacts for us were less about the place changes, although those were useful, but more that the group of residents who didn't know each other before came together around this project and have since incorporated and formed a residents association. They're now running a program of placemaking events. They just finished one this summer. So the social impacts of that to me are far more long-range and significant. Another example is play streets, and this is I think a simple idea. It's not new. It's very well proven in many other places around the world, of reprogramming streets that may be underutilised on weekends, but you could close them to cars over the weekend and turn them into a pedestrian or people space instead of a vehicle space. So this is a pilot that we did with Vic Health and City of Melbourne, and it was started by asking expressions of interest for different streets, because perhaps you don't want to close every street. One of them, which wouldn't seem that hard to close, really, if you look at it, a single lane new street, but also seemed that maybe it's not such a popular central focal meeting point for that neighbourhood either. But this was a street that was proposed to be closed, New Street in Kensington. We worked with a bunch of local residents to letterbox drop and invite others to come, and then 300 people came down in that afternoon. We had a permit for 50, which we didn't say anything about. But it just, to me, showed that, one, there's a huge change of demographic in this area, a lot of young families, and there hasn't been an increase much in the way of green space, and there's a strong demand for play streets. But this project, sponsored by Vic Health, was all about physical activity and how do we return to getting children more active in the street. So boxcar races, so cute. I must say, this is my son winning in the middle until he didn't win. And then we had a sort of half-hour kind of consolation about it's okay if you don't win all the time scenario. But certainly there was heaps of kids who got out, a lot of feedback, and sort of paved the way for creating a Play Streets program more broadly. What we found through these projects and the 100 or so others that we've done that I haven't mentioned today is that they're quite simple in some ways. They're installed over a weekend, they're bringing people together, but perhaps for my local government colleagues in the room, you would probably be thinking, this actually might be a little bit challenging. How would I get a permit for that? Where would that fit? I'm not sure. And what we found is that that's a very, very common challenge. We want to inspire communities to do more, but we actually have a lot of barriers in place inadvertently to making that happen. In our own experience, trying to install a parklet outside our office, we almost got arrested when we tried to do it just with chalk. And then we tried to get a permit, and it took us 6 months. And that's a map of all the touch points that we had trying to get a permit for it. And again, it's because this falls out of any kind of usual system. It's not because it's a complicated project. It's just like, I don't know what to do with this. But then we found out that you could get a skip bin on the spot for $20. And that was a simpler solution. But I think what this showed was that there was a really great, simple process for something like putting a rubbish bin in the street. We just needed that kind of format or process of putting a park in the street, right? It actually, the template already existed. Unfortunately, this got photographed by a really famous Melbourne blogger, and it went all over the world as being like Melbourne hipsters are sinking to a new low, eating lunch out of a skip. We ended up putting the funding that we did have into a park in a trailer instead that doesn't need a permit anywhere. But in this regard, the problem is both. It's not just about social engagement and isolation. It's about sorry, just go back one. It's also about the process. That's all right. It's also about the processes involved. And I'm not going to talk about this program today. I'm finishing this here. But what we did do based on those experiences is formulate a program called the Neighbourhood Project, which works like we call it a neighbourhood boot camp, where we work with local governments on process innovation to have a look at how your interface works with placemaking, how you can support communities to take greater leadership, and what small tweaks you might want to make in your ecosystem to make that experience easier for both parties. And I think by looking at process as well as people and place, we can transform neighbourhoods from the ground up. Thanks.